Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, 9th of November. I'm Cindy Yu, the Spectator's assistant editor and your host this week. Coming up on the show, the pro-Palestine marches will return this Saturday, the biggest yet, organisers say. What is at stake with allowing these protests to go ahead on Armistice Day? Counter-extremism expert Acheson and writer Joanna join me to discuss. And while the world's attention is on Gaza, what about the West Bank? That's the question the philosopher Slavoj Žižek raises in this week's magazine, and he joins the show to talk about how the West Bank could provide a way out of this conflict, if only Netanyahu's government would see the light. We also continue to cover the COVID inquiry, with revelations this week that the second lockdown may have been decided on false information. Our data editor, Michael Simmons, joins the show. And finally, what problems lie ahead with the rise of porn made cheaply and quickly by AI? Our columnist Sam Leith has written about this, and he joins the show alongside Spectator contributor and anti-porn campaigner Julie Bindel. Before we get going, if you like Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thousands are joining our channel every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. And thank you to our sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support during challenging times. To find out more, visit candowealth.com for more information. First up, for the cover piece this week, counter-extremism expert and former prisons governor Acheson looks at the politics of policing protests. The Met are allowing the protests to go ahead on Saturday, but can they handle what will be the biggest marches yet? Ian is with me now, alongside the writer Joanna, who looks at the Met's inconsistencies on the Spectator's Coffee House blog this week. Ian and Joanna, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, Ian, I want to start with that Suella Braverman article in The Times from Wednesday night. In a piece lambasting the Met for being biased in the way it polices protests, she says, and I quote, "I do not believe that these marches are merely a cry for help for Gaza. They are an assertion of primacy by certain groups, particularly Islamists, of the kind we are more used to seeing in Northern Ireland." What do you make of that?
Well, quite a lot, frankly, coming from Northern Ireland. I think it was a pretty unwise analogy to draw. She's probably managed to do what's almost impossible in Northern Ireland, and that is unite two communities in condemnation. Because the wider implication of what she's saying is that, civil rights marches or Orange Order marches are equivalent to, Hamas supporting marches. Of course, she didn't mean that. She was talking, I hope, in a much narrower way about the commemoration of terrorism within some marches in Northern Ireland, which absolutely does take place, particularly in paramilitary funerals. But at the same time, I think that was an unfortunate comparison to draw. And it takes away from, the absolutely legitimate points that she has been making, that these marches are infiltrated by people who've got virulently anti-Semitic opinions. And my view was, in the Spectator piece I wrote yesterday for the magazine, that, Mark Rowley has now said he can guarantee that there will be an assertive policing operation over the weekend, and particularly around the Armistice 2-minute silence, and he needs to be held to account for that. So, it's a very big test for the Met. I hope they're up for it. But, Home Secretaries are entitled to talk about policing, and she is reflecting a widely held public perception that the police are too soft on these marches. And we have to see an assertive presence where existing laws are enforced. That's the key thing. It's not about needing new laws. And I think Mark Rowley, if I might say, went a bit off script as well when he seemed to be complaining that he didn't have enough laws to enforce. There's public order legislation, and there's racial and religious hate legislation that needs to be seen to be enforced, not 2 weeks after the event, but immediately, to give back confidence that London is being protected and policed without fear or favour.
Now, Ian, at the time of filming, Mark Rowley has said that the protest will still be going ahead on Saturday. Do you think he's made the right call there?
Well, I think the bar for banning a protest is extremely high, and necessarily so. I mean, the right for peaceful assembly and protest is a very precious one, and it's protected by legislation. And there's very high bar for that being interfered with, and rightly so, because it's a pressure valve, and apart from lots of other things, to be able to allow peaceful process to take part in this country. And ironically, one of the things we celebrate in Remembrance Weekend is the fact that so many people fought and died from the UK and across the empire. I think it would take a lot for him to be able to say that he has intelligence that suggests there would be serious risk to public life or public disorder, for him to ask the Home Secretary to ban it. So on the basis of what we know, I think he's applied the law correctly. But I go back to my original point. This is a massive test for Sir Mark and for his men and women who'll be on the front line this weekend. And we must see that the parade, the Armistice 2-minute silence, and the parade that happens quite a long time after it is properly and professionally and assertively policed.
Joanna, would you agree with that? Because for the Spectator's website, Coffee House, this week, you've also written about the inconsistency in the way in which the Met have policed these pro-Palestine protests compared to, let's say, the Sarah Everard vigils. I mean, this is also a point that Suella Braverman has made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can see some quite big discrepancies. To be clear, though, I absolutely think the marchers should be allowed to go ahead. I agree with Ian on that. I completely disagree with the marchers. I think that there are lots of problems with the marchers, but I think if you want to live in a country that supports freedom of speech, supports the right for people to protest, then you cannot stop marches going ahead simply because you don't agree with the principles of the protesters.
And Joanna, just looking at the Met as well, something else you point out in your piece is this former advisor for the Met, Atiq Malik. Can you tell us about him and why it's important, his story?
Mm-hmm. So Atiq Malik is a pro-Palestinian supporter who has a long history of activism. He's a lawyer from Luton, but he has a long history of working with the Muslim community and advancing causes close to the heart of members of that community, which in this instance involves being pro-Palestine. He has spoken at a pro-Palestinian rally when Israel was involved in a conflict in Gaza a couple of years ago, and he was filmed making the chant, leading crowds in the chant of From the River to the Sea, and also making comments which have been about kind of Zionist control of the media, as an explanation as to why more press coverage wasn't being given to his side of the argument. And this comment is being widely interpreted as being anti-Semitic. Now, to me, that doesn't seem like a suitable person to have advising for policing. It just seems like a very simple, straightforward Google search would reveal this information. And I personally don't think that this is somebody, if I was involved in the policing of a march, that this is the type of person who I would think would be suitable to have, or kind of somebody who I could trust to give an objective, neutral, balanced, non-partisan viewpoint on what was happening, particularly when you're under pressure to make very quick, spur-of-the-moment decisions. And yet clearly somebody at the Met thought that Atiq Malik was just the right kind of person to have in the control room, observing the protests and offering minute by minute advice, or potentially we don't know what his role was. We just know he was there as an observer. This was the day that people in the crowds were spotted chanting jihad, and the Met issued a statement explaining that the word jihad has many different definitions, and we need to be sympathetic in our interpretation of how that word was being used. Now, we don't know whether Malik was the person who provided those different definitions of jihad and kind of said that this wasn't a cause to arrest someone. But the very fact that he was present in the room when that decision was being made means that this suspicion hangs over the policing of the event.
Incredible. Ian, you're former prisons governor. You have seen what it's like to have crowd control issues, to have work for large institutions, public institutions. What do you think can explain this episode when it comes to the Met? How can they basically not know who their senior advisors are and whether or not they're impartial?
Well, it's an extraordinary feeling, but I'm afraid it's not surprising. If you look at the organisation that Mark Rowley inherited, it is riven with dysfunction, and I think that dysfunction extends to a senior command level, where you will have gold command control rooms festooned with human rights advisors who seem to take priority over public order policing. So I think the balance has got out of kilter, and with that, the tolerance of having people who are completely unsuitable for giving advice, like Mr. Malik clearly is, becomes wider and wider. And I think there's a broader issue that I bang on about all the time in social media, which I would call institutional timidity. And it's a sort of infection that I think is spreading across public services, particularly uniformed public services, where there seems to be more and more of a reluctance to be able to confront particularly hateful behaviour in the interests of some sort of spurious community views or based on very unrepresentative views that are put out there by community representatives, so called. So I think the Met needs to get back to a policing operation this weekend, and it needs to realise that this is a seminal moment, as I said in my piece, for the Metropolitan Police and Mark Rowley, and in fact you could take it broader and say for the rule of law, because thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who aren't at those marches, have looked on with total dismay at the way that virulent anti-Semitism seems to have free rein. We've got a tiny minority of people, Jewish people in this country, one of the smallest religious minorities in the country, many of whom are terrified to go into our capital city in a weekend because they meet these malevolent marches that seem to be asserting their dominance and their utter impunity to do whatever they like and go whatever they like. We've got to draw some lines in the sand here, and it's down to the police to do that. So, again, there is a massive test here. And if Mark Rowley fails that test, and he has said he will deliver an effective and asserting policing operation this weekend, I think then we need to ask really fundamental questions about our values and how they may be being eroded from the inside by marches of such impunity that are taking place, and are likely to continue to take place for events that are, thousands of miles away.
I agree with what Ian's just said, but I'm not sure I completely think that timidity is the only explanation for what's going on here. I actually think that the police, along with perhaps a number of other institutions in our society, have become almost a little bit confused about what their core purpose is. Particularly as regards to large demonstrations and demonstrations of a political nature. I think some of the values, if you like, that are dominant amongst perhaps the equity, diversity and inclusion officers or kind of values that have been taken on board by the police as core values central to their mission as well. So then when they meet protesters who actually appear to share the values that they've been told are important, I think that creates some sense of confusion around what the actual role of the police is. I mean, how do you arrest people when it's a cause that you have been told you should have some sympathy with, whether that's coming from the College of Policing or perhaps coming from some of the membership organisations within the campaign, or coming from the EDI training that officers are expected to partake in. I think it creates this confusion about core purpose. I think, for example, if you have a lot of worry, I mean, and perhaps for good reason, worry about being perceived as being racist, or you're worried about being perceived as Islamophobic, then your approach is going to be far different than if your main concern is worry about being anti-Semitic, or purely and simply worry about upholding the law in the most objective and neutral way possible.
A big test indeed for Sir Mark Rowley. Joanna Williams and Ian Acheson, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Next, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek writes for the magazine this week about the depths of despair for Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. He argues that it is not justifying or excusing violence to look at the context of the conflict more widely. Slavoj joins me now. Slavoj Žižek, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, in The Spectator this week, you highlight the despair of Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but within the West Bank as well. Now, many have sought to explain the Hamas attacks within the context of occupation and colonial struggle. Now, in your view as a philosopher, does this despair ever justify violence of any kind? And in your article, you try to give this context, but does that mean that you're excusing or justifying this violence yourself?
No, my position was here very clear, because I was accused, yes, that I, in a more refined, twisted way, that I somehow justify the Hamas violence. And then the idea was even, no, at this tragic moment, we don't speak about complexity. It's just, we should be shocked at what happened. I agree, absolutely. But there is a but. But I took the example of Hitler, my God. There are dozens of books explaining the background, which was the confused situation of suffering of ordinary Germans and so on, that was exploited by Hitler, by the Nazis, to grab power. And it's, for me, a similar thing that has to be done with the Hamas attack. I unconditionally condemn it. I even wrote, Israel has not only the right to defend itself, but also the right to annihilate Hamas. But what really worries me is that Hamas on the Palestinian side and the present government of Israel on the Israeli side are really doing something that one cannot but call, following that metaphor, it takes two to tango. These are two radical stances. I'm not equalizing them in the sense of evil and so on. But nonetheless, these are two comparable stances in the sense that each of them wants to get rid of, annihilate the enemy. Hamas said clearly, kill the Jews should be thrown out, the Jews don't belong here. The hardliners around Netanyahu are saying the same. This is primarily our land, it's exclusively our land. Where does this leave Palestinians? Of course, it is pushing them to despair. So I even went a step further and said that from Hamas we got a totally inexcusable violent attack. But from the other side, look, for me it's more crucial than Gaza. Look what is now happening on the West Bank. It's what one cannot but call gradual ethnic cleansing with constant violence of settlers against Palestinians there. And it's not just a gentle violence. People are killed, beaten to death, and so on. And it's not something that happened now after October the 7th. It's going on permanently. And even the United States voiced their serious concern about this. So what I am afraid is that both extreme sides, hardliners in Israeli government and Hamas, are in some sense echoing each other, and objectively, not subjectively. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. They are supporting each other. Let's face it, the inexcusable attack on Gaza served the government of Israel perfectly to divert attention from what is going on the West Bank and to proceed with much greater speed now towards gradual ethnic cleansing on the West.
Sorry, Slavoj, what do you mean the inexcusable attack on Gaza? Do you mean the October 7th attacks on...
No, sorry, I meant, the Hamas attack.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, to be clear here, which, again, this is not, as I was often accused, this is not just a formal condemnation so that I can then proceed to Israel bashing. No, I knew people who knew people who were slaughtered by Hamas there. As we all know, the paradox is that these were people who were absolutely open to Palestinians, having the Jewish settlers who were slaughtered, having contact with Gaza all the time, helping Gaza, and so on and so on. So the message of Hamas attack was clear. They were not killed because they stood for the worst of Israeli militarism. No, they were peace-loving Jews. They were killed, and the message was no peace with Jews. War to the end. So again, I have no illusions here about Hamas. It's a fundamentalist terrorist organization. But I think here problems emerge that what is going on the West Bank especially, for years now, this constant pressure, and you can find numerous podcasts on YouTube and so on, because Palestinians also have iPhones and so on, which make you sick. Settlers protected, even supported by Israeli police and military units, terrorized, focused, for example, on a Palestinian household on a farm, threatened them, beat them, also kill them. After October 7th, only over 150 Palestinians were killed in such operations, and Israel does nothing. So here is the tragedy for me, how both sides raise tension. Of course, by endlessly repeating these images of the horrors of the Hamas attack, which Israel, of course, has the full right to do. Israel, what I'm afraid it is doing is that instead of using this as a unique chance of peace, instead of saying to Palestinians, Hamas is out, but now here is what we offer you on the West Bank, at least. No, they are using this to raise to a higher level the brutal tension, pushing Palestinians there into despair. And what worries me at least as much as this, and here I simply rationally don't understand what Israel is doing, it is that by this inexcusably brutal attack on Gaza, yes, Hamas has to be annihilated, but the way Israel is doing it, with exploding numbers of so-called collateral damage, children, and so on, can you even imagine what this is doing to anti-Semitism? What a new boost this is giving to anti-Semitism.
Slavoj Žižek, how is it possible to annihilate Hamas, as you say, in Gaza without, when it's such a densely populated area, and we do suspect that Gaza, that Hamas has crucial infrastructure under civilian infrastructure in tunnels in Gaza? You know, if you're in the Israeli government, how is it possible to annihilate Hamas, as you say, without that kind of casualty? I mean, we now see that that kind of bombardment has allowed ground forces to go into and surround Gaza City. Without it, the IDF couldn't be doing what it's doing right now.
Oh, no, I mean, I know, I'm not saying it's an easy solution, but to do it a little bit more, not gradually in the sense of prolonging it for months and so on, but okay, let me give you one example. You remember now, it must be already 2-3 weeks ago, when Israel, for the first time, gave 24-hour chance to citizens of northern Gaza, of the Gaza City, to move south. Now, wasn't this an absolutely absurd proposal? 1.2 million people, many of them in hospitals, pregnant women and so on, cannot simply move to outside. How? How should this be done? So what I'm saying is, yes, one has to destroy Hamas, but isn't there also a limit to so-called collateral damage? There should be a way which I find even relatively easy to imagine. For example, okay, you surround Gaza, then you establish slowly safety corridors where, of course, you check people and so on. There is a whole network of procedures which could be done. I think it's which could make the operation much more human. Otherwise, isn't it a little bit too simple? Okay, I don't trust the Palestinian numbers, but for sure, many more people died in Gaza than in the Israeli attack. And on the other hand, I agree that the situation is complex, how Hamas is in a terrifying way using people as a shield and so on and so on. But isn't there nonetheless a limit to saying, okay, we killed one terrorist and I don't know what would be the number, 30, 40 innocent Palestinians, children dead are just collateral damage. It's a too easy solution for me. In a more gradual way, it could have been done.
You're the philosopher here.
Sorry?
You're the philosopher here, and what you're talking about this kind of calculus of how much lives are worth. What do you think? What should be guiding? What is the balance to be struck here when you've got these objectives? And I hear what you're saying about the Netanyahu government, and I think a lot of liberal secular Israelis before October 7th would have agreed with you on disagreeing with Netanyahu's government. But what is the balance to be struck? Are you providing answers here?
Sorry?
Are you providing answers in terms of how... Yes, in terms of how the government should be dealing with it instead?
But why... This is already typical. Why do we focus on Gaza? I think the real thing now is happening on the West Bank. Much intensified what one cannot but call ethnic cleansing there. Why Israel, one way for Israel to provide a different message to Palestinians would be to stop the ethnic cleansing on the West Bank. And
to show that another way is possible.
At the same time,
to show that another way is possible.
Yeah. This is the only way for me to fully justify, and it can be justified, the attack on Gaza. At the same time, you have to show exactly the Palestinians there is another way. Or, as somebody who certainly cannot be accused of being pro-Hamas, Yuval Noah Harari said, we have to offer Palestinians who don't support terror, who are not anti-Semitic, we have to offer them a clear way how to live freely and in a dignified way in their own homeland. This is the term used by Harari. Or look at what, for example, other Israeli politicians, more liberal, have said, that the key, the underlying tension is the unresolved Palestinian question. On the one hand, I don't buy this pseudo-leftist version of what Israel is doing there is simply neo-colonialism, colonizing a country. No, Jewish people have a certain right to the land, but not exclusive right. But so do Palestinians. The only way to resolve, again, the point is now from the side of Israel to offer Palestinians a clear hope, not just to put pressure on them. And again, I agree with you. It is problematic to set a clear limit, how much collateral damage and so on and so on. I'm only saying, obviously, it should have been possible to do it in a better, more considerate way, if for no other reason, for the incredible damage that this is doing to Jews all around. Can you imagine what impression, these constant images of children being killed in Gaza and so on, what they will do to the explosion of anti-Semitism?
Slavoj Žižek, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. The COVID inquiry continues this week, but missed by Baroness Hallett is a shocking revelation in the written testimony of a former Number 10 advisor. It raises an important question. Did a second lockdown happen on a false premise, justified by a model that had already been proven wrong? Did the government knowingly mislead the public? Michael Simmons, our data editor, writes about this story in this week's issue, and he joins Spectator TV now. But first, let's revisit what happened in that monumental press conference on October 31st, 2020, where a second lockdown was announced.
The modelling group asked a number of academic groups to create scenarios as to what might happen on assumptions that R stays above 1 and goes between 1.3, 1.5 and possibly up over the course of the winter. And the next slide shows the early working from 2 weeks ago of some of those groups looking at deaths in England over the winter period.
Michael joins me on the show now. So, Michael, this graph was torn apart in the days after the press conference, called out by statisticians already. So, first of all, what is the problem with the graph?
So basically, the graph overestimated the peak of deaths, and that was because the R number that was fed into the models, and just to remind people, the R number is the reproduction rate of the virus, was basically too high. Now, the reason that was spotted so quickly, there was various pieces about it, the Stats Authority ended up criticising it, was because you could already plug in the actuals for the days leading up to that press conference, and they were already, way overestimated. And at the time, it was just thought that this was a fumble by government, this was a mistake, this was a model that hadn't been properly scrutinised. But it looks like from Ben Warner's evidence that actually it wasn't a fumble. They knew that this graph was wrong, but used it anyway.
Right, and that's what your piece is about this week. Not about the graph being wrong, but what they knew when. And so first of all, just tell us, who is Ben Warner? Why is it important what he has to say?
So Ben Warner was brought into Number 10 Downing Street the day after the election win, and he was going to be basically the chief SPAD in charge of data and digital. And very quickly, because of his data expertise, he ended up heavily involved in the COVID response for much of 2020. So Ben Warner was involved in basically, he acted sort of as a channel between Sage. He attended Sage on behalf of Dominic Cummings, and he would report what was being said in Sage back to those officials in Number 10. And that's basically exactly what happened here with this graph. He spotted this graph, he screenshotted it and started to circulate it within Number 10. So that's where kind of this graph comes from.
Right, but at the time, someone did warn government already that this graph was wrong, and that's where Angela McLean comes in, is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So Ben himself started to realise when he'd looked at deaths data that maybe there was something wrong with this graph. He also noted that it wasn't, it hadn't gone through SAGE or SPI-M, so it hadn't been officially signed off. Then on the day of the lockdown was announced, so that Halloween day, he had a phone call with Angela McLean, who basically flagged that new data had been looked at that showed that, as we were saying earlier, that R number was lower and that the peak was probably going to be about half of the level that was actually showing on that graph. So Ben Warner finished that phone call, went straight into the cabinet room, according to his evidence, and flagged to the Prime Minister and other officials that this graph was wrong and shouldn't be used in the press conference.
Incredible. And this is in his written testimonial, right? So what he's actually saying is that he warned people in government about this wrong graph, so they knew.
Absolutely. So Ben says that, not just that he knew and then flagged it to the Prime Minister and his officials, but other people, Angela McLean, a chap from the government's Office for Science, knew that this graph shouldn't be used. So multiple officials knew that it wouldn't be used. But Ben Warner actually goes further in his evidence that after he left the cabinet room, having flagged the issues with the graph, he was under the impression that it was not going to be used. I think he'd agreed with Angela McLean that they were going to use this reasonable worst case scenario instead. A different one, which was a lot closer to what actually ended up happening. So he left. It left work for that day thinking that he'd, squashed this graph and it wasn't going to be used. He'd done his job. But then he says, it wasn't till it went on TV that he discovered that no, the graph was used.
That is so shocking. But also, what's also shocking is the fact that Ben Warner has been up against the COVID inquiry this week, talking to Baroness Hallett. But this question wasn't one that she asked him. So you spotted this in the written data.
Yeah. So, there's two kind of sections of evidence in the inquiry. So there's what you say in the hearings, and then there's the statements which every witness gives. And I should just sort of shout out Oliver Johnson, who's a professor that occasionally writes for us. He kind of spotted this originally and alerted us to it. And basically this was in, midway through his evidence document where he goes into the section about how the second lockdown came about. And the inquiry cases basically didn't go down that line of questioning because they don't seem to be interested in finding out the decisions behind lockdown. It's a lot more, was lockdown too late? Who was swearing on WhatsApp? So that didn't come up in the spoken parts of the inquiry. That presents a specific problem for journalists and the public because Ben Warner's evidence in this section references, the slides, the emails, the discussions about this graph, but we're not able to see them because the way public inquiries are set up, you can only see the evidence that's spoken about or shown in the actual hearings. So the actual emails where he's discussing these graphs, we can only take his word for it. They won't be released unless he's either called back to the inquiry or Baroness Hallett decides to include it in her report. And
unless the inquiry questions those involved at the time, we won't know why it was the government went ahead and released the graph that they knew seemed to have been warned was wrong. I mean, we don't know exactly what Patrick Vallence's role was in all of this, how much he and Chris Whitty knew, but Ben Warner says that he warned some people in government at least, but we'll never know what that process is because the inquiry is not asking about it.
Yep, exactly. So we cannot see the email that Ben Warner references in his written statement unless it is specifically shown in an inquiry hearing. So they would either have to call him or others back to go over that, or Baroness Hallett can look at it herself and include it in her final report. But if that's the case, it's going to be years before we, get to the truth of this.
Wow, it's incredible. I mean, obviously the inquiry has so much, like a trove of evidence to go through for everyone. So you can imagine maybe they just missed it. But what do you think this says about the inquiry itself? You kind of already hinted at it when it comes to what the focus, the emphasis really is of the inquiry.
Yeah, I think this is another problem. I mean, look, the inquiry cases and Baroness Hallett, they've got a huge task on their hands because there is just so much to go through. I mean, every witness is submitting like 90-page statements and they're only there for a few hours to be questioned. So you can't ask them about everything. But a lot of the inquiry that I've watched seems to be focused on what I would personally say is, quite trivial number 10 personalities, what was said on WhatsApp. I mean, just an example of one thing they did ask Ben Warner about rather than this was there was some WhatsApp where someone had said that Ben Warner was screaming this piece of information, and Ben Warner was asked if the screaming was literal or metaphorical. I mean, like, what relevance is that to anything? So to me, the inquiry just seems to have the wrong narrative at the moment.
Very concerning, but also, Michael, grateful to you for following it. Michael Simmons, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And finally, AI-generated pornography is rapidly on the rise, according to researchers. You could, as some American teenage boys did recently, put the faces of the women that you know on sexually explicit content and for it to look very real indeed. The Spectator's Sam Leith has written about this for Coffee House this week, and in an industry wrapped up in sexual exploitation, human trafficking, how could this change the future of porn? He joins me now alongside feminist writer and campaigner Julie Bindel. Sam and Julie, welcome to Spectator TV. Now, Sam, for Coffee House this week, you've written about the rise of AI porn. Can you explain what you mean by AI porn and how fast that rise has been?
Well, it's the sort of pornography of the no humans involved variety, where what AI has become really, really good at, it turns out, is kind of creating out of a compost of billions of images. And God knows, the internet is 80% porn anyway. It's got all these billions of images available to it, and it trains the AI to create new images, lifelike scenes and videos involving, essentially completely generated people. Actually, what sparked my interest in it this week was that there was a piece in, I think, the Wall Street Journal saying that this stuff was being used for blackmail, in the sense that people, there's an old revenge porn thing. People say, I've got an intimate, compromising photograph of you or a video of you having sex. I'm going to send it to all your friends unless you give me a Bitcoin, or I'm going to shame you or bully you with it. And what had happened is that now AI can generate effectively fake nudes of real people by either taking clothed photographs of them and extrapolating from that, or simply kind of seamlessly putting their face onto existing pornographic footage. So it's quite alarming what the technology can do. And according to the Wall Street Journal, it's causing the people on the receiving end of this some real distress.
Now, Julie, you've spent so much of your life campaigning against porn and violence against women and girls. What do you make of this rise of AI porn?
Well, I disagree with Sam that it's a porn with no humans involved. And I'll just give another example of why I think that this causes real harm. And in fact is way more insidious in many ways than we could imagine. A few years ago, I went to the LA Porn Awards. Didn't win anything, but there you go. I was reporting on it. And there was a new product on sale at the time, which was sex dolls, very realistic porn dolls, sex dolls, which whatever you want to call them, made a very like life images of famous female porn actors that men could buy, so that they are just effectively having sex with, violating, abusing the effigy of a real person. And some of the porn actors told me that they found it really distressing. There was nothing they could do about it. Now, if we look at AI-generated porn, it's not just being used for blackmail. It's also being used as sex therapy, which is the most abhorrent thing that I can imagine. First of all, the notion that there are these men who are hardwired as so-called paedophiles, which is nonsense. It's a cultural norm, not a hardwired genetic. There's no paedophile gene. So what the AI creators or the AI apologists are saying is that if you actually create child abuse imagery that doesn't involve real harm to real children, these men will be satisfied, as though there are these men that have a craving for sex with children that has to be satisfied in a way that the alcoholic has to have a drink. This is a myth, and it seeks to just normalise the swathes of men that do seek out child abuse imagery, from the kind of schoolgirl in a uniform, whether she's 16, 18 or 14, through to hardcore stuff. And actually, using AI child abuse imagery is like pouring petrol on an already flaming fire, because what in fact it does is desensitizes men, because it usually almost always is men, to the notion that children, even babies, are being sexually abused, because they can justify it by saying, well, of course, I'm not really harming children, but I'm curious, because the way the porn trade works, its money model is to push more and more, harder, raise the bar all the time, so more money is spent. But another thing is, and this perhaps is the most concerning, that men have a ready-made excuse if they are found with child abuse imagery to say, well, of course, these are AI created, or at least that's what I was told. And AI creators of child abuse imagery, or the illegal porn, which would be illegal if it's being done to real women, in real time, could also market it as though this is AI generated. So all it does is drive more traffic to the most abusive imagery and absolutely fuels the fire already raging.
Sam?
No, I'm intrigued by that. I don't think I was intending to imply when I said no humans involved that this was, all tickety boo. And I think Julie, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. We're talking about images of child abuse, for instance. I mean, it struck me that there's sort of two ends to this, and and I absolutely yield to you and your expertise on how they connect. One of which is, it seems to me that, the real life abuse that takes place in the creation of old school slave food porn, which you have admirably made it, your business to find out about and investigate and expose over many, many years. And the other is what you describe, the fuel on the fire, that the imagery helps to cultivate, to normalize, to encourage appetites. And they are often appetites for more and more extreme material, for, the taboo. I mean, there does seem to be a thing whereby the more taboo something is, the more people, or some people, are going to find it sexy. And that therefore that's why the sort of baseline constantly moving. And it struck me as a thought experiment, which is what I was writing about in my piece, was, look, if a lot of mainstream pornography, and I'm leaving to one side for a second, if you like, rape and child rape and that sort of really extreme end of it. But if your basic workaday, ordinary vanilla filth, such as it is, were to be generated so cheaply and effectively by AI, would that have, at least at one end of this two-ended issue, the effect of essentially removing some of the market for the more expensive, real person exploitative, traditional porn, if you like, where people are setting up studios, they're trafficking and exploiting very often, the performers, there's all sorts of risk and consent issues, and there's a lot of really, really nasty stuff goes on in the real world as a result. Do you think, leaving aside the question of the appetites that the extreme stuff might fuel, which I'm very much not brushing aside, but leaving that to one side, is there a case that, AI porn might help to put a dent in an industry that does an awful lot of real world harm?
Well, first of all, Sam, I wasn't for a second thinking that you were actually advocating for more AI porn. That isn't how I read the piece at all. In fact, I thought it was a very, very carefully argued piece that asked some absolutely crucial questions, and I thought it was very, very nuanced and responsibly written. But first of all, the best business model that the porn industry ever came up with was free porn, which actually puts a dent in the argument about AI porn, putting a dent in the kind of pay for business. Because what free porn did was it normalized the use of porn for those that were not thinking of themselves at that time as porn consumers. And that included children, so 11-year-old boys, or it included men who aren't disrespectful of women, who do have quite healthy real life sex lives with real live women that's consensual, but who thought, well, I'll give it a bit of a whirl. And of course, they're not going to put their credit card into the app. They're going to just start off on the free porn. And then, of course, and I don't buy the addiction model. I disagree with those feminists that suggest that it's addictive. I do think that it gets compulsive. And I know the way that the business model pushes and pushes just that kind of more and more extreme. Your algorithms are very carefully monitored. And then you're given something a bit more risque or a bit more close to illegality, a bit more close to looking as though it might be child abuse imagery. And then, of course, the credit cards can come out. So I think that that's a problem with the arguments about AI. Because what AI will do is exactly what legal brothels, for example, at the other side of the sex trade, do for the illegal industry. It acts as a smokescreen, it acts as a driver, and it acts as a gateway. Now, not a gateway in the way that people argue that cannabis is a gateway to heroin. I don't buy that at all. What I mean is that because there isn't, and this is my main argument, there isn't such a thing as a paedophile, the medical model that's hardwired to want to have sex with children, or rape children rather. This means that it's a cultural drive, and the more we normalize it, and of course AI will rely, its business will rely on child abuse imagery within the next 5 years. It will be almost totally child abuse imagery. So we're driving more and more men to the more normalized version, and as I say, an excuse that they thought it was all just AI and no child could possibly have been harmed in the meantime.
And Sam, can I come in here, because you also suggest that this is a genie out of the bottle. So do you think that nothing can be done basically to regulate this, to turn back the tide?
It seems to me, if you look at the world's track record, country by country, internationally, in regulating almost anything on the internet, it's pretty poor. I mean, the protocols of the Elders of Zion are still zooming around the internet. Fake news has proliferated rather than disappearing. This whole idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant and a completely open internet will mean that, that everything will be transparent and we'll all be able to see the truth, turned out to be the exact opposite of the truth. So, if we can't get rid of, fake Gandhi quotes, the chances that we can get rid of, artificially generated, which can be done at scale, of course. An AI can produce a, hour and a half long porn film, I'm assuming, or certainly will soon be able to, in a matter of moments, and it will be able to change it, and it will be able to put whoever you want in it, and it will be, the idea that the slow, laborious business of copyright law and takedowns and international jurisdictions is going to be able to handle this seems to me to be a very, very optimistic one.
Julie, you must be very concerned about that, because at least in the current form of the porn industry, you've got these major studios, you've got the major companies, you've got the major websites that you can kind of track. But what we're seeing here is, kids, teenagers, and just your average normal people taking this technology, and they have the capability of creating that.
Well, Sam's absolutely right. The internet is not policeable, but it is very difficult to do so. But there has to be the willingness also. I mean, in countries like Sweden and Norway and various others where, for example, the purchase of sex, prostituted sex, has been criminalised, police have got pretty good at having a look on the internet and tracking down gangs of pimps and sexual exploitation in general. And I think that they could do more than they're doing. And I'm not a kind of ban it all, make it all illegal, because actually we're starting off from the point where there is a proliferation, and we need to think much more closely about the way that we have normalized sexual abuse imagery in general, not just of children, but of adult women and men across the board, and what that means in terms of relationships, what it means in terms of consensual sexual encounters, when in fact sex dolls, porn dolls, are becoming way more, normalized throughout that kind of industry. But I just want to flip it the other way around in a way, because we've got AI, obviously because of technological progress, at the end of a spate of pornography being available pretty much everywhere. I mean, porn now actually drives technology rather than the other way around, where we now have permission for more violent, degrading, abusive rape porn, gagging, choking, the kind of porn that is way more kind of acceptable than it was 20 years ago. Partly because the pornographers tested the market by using cartoon imagery. And if we think about Hustler, the infamous cover of Hustler magazine, with a cartoon image of a woman being put headfirst through a meat grinder to depict her as just a piece of meat that was there as, or a set of orifices for men to do what they wanted with, it was extremely effective. There are other images that were tried and tested in Playboy, which I can't even describe on this podcast because it's too distressing, which, because it was cartoon form, they got away with it. Now we're in a situation where AI will be able to go way further. And remember, many men, many consumers of hardcore violent porn enjoy their subject being abused. They enjoy the sadistic pleasure. They want to see them hurt. And the thing about an AI image, an AI model, is they know that there's no pain being felt, and that that is something that will drive them back and forth from AI back to the porn involving real live women being abused on set.
Now, Julie, what about the role of payment systems and the companies like MasterCard, Visa, PayPal, for example? Because I've read that their support and their cutting off of their support for websites like Pornhub have actually really damaged Pornhub's traffic because the payment companies deemed what they were doing as a bit too extreme, and that has actually had quite a real impact. So is that the way to regulate the industry?
It absolutely could. And in fact, if you look at what happened a couple of years ago with MindGeek and Pornhub, which is one of the sites that MindGeek own, the biggest porn business on the planet, it was really successful when, after a huge outcry from those of us that do campaign to expose porn's reality, the hell of it, where there were countless videos uploaded of girls, not just women, girls being raped and otherwise abused. When that all came out, thanks to the campaigning and the exposure, several big credit card companies bowed to pressure and said, okay, we won't accept payments through Pornhub. It needs to clean up its act, and this is unacceptable. And then, of course, bit by bit, it's crept back so that now the big credit card companies are now accepting payment. So we need to keep the pressure on. But I think practically that's the only thing we can do. There's no resources in policing and there's no willingness. And most police officers, male police officers, are consuming porn, quite frankly. And not only that, but what hurts the pornographers is the cash being, that their revenue is threatened in any way. What turns pornographers on is not the sex, it's the cash. And that's where we need to direct all our efforts.
Julie, you'll have chapter and verse on this, but I remember there was a kind of really shocking thing that broke through about Pornhub, that people started to look into its system for flagging images of abuse, trafficked people, stolen images, rape, all these underage participants. And there was a whole thing where I think they had literally one person for this entire site. You'll remind me if I'm getting this right, who was supposedly in charge of takedowns, and nothing would be brought to their attention unless it had already been flagged 3 times by 3 separate people, regardless of what it was. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
That's exactly right. I can't remember if it was 1 person or 1.5 people on a job share, but it was a scandal. And I interviewed a young woman who, when she was 15, was gang raped, and that video of her gang rape was up on Pornhub. And it was only after years of her complaining, begging, writing letters, emailing, getting her friends and her parents to do so, that finally a lawyer came on board, sent a legal letter, and they decided to take the video down. And that was some time that she had to fight for that to happen. That should be instant and de rigueur. And they can also, of course, filter. They can vet these videos. In reality, MindGeek, Pornhub, and these big sites, they know that those rape videos drive traffic. They know that they do. There is no such thing as ethical porn. There is some porn that's less bad than other porn genres, but there is no ethical porn, and there is no ethical porn industry.
Julie and Sam, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, if you do enjoy Spectator TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support during challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information. Thanks again for watching, and join us again next week.